Now that we've covered an intro of why nutrition is important, key nutrients, and the fundamentals of a healthy diet, it's time to get more into the sports nutrition side of things. First, we need to learn about energy. How energy is used by the body, how much we need, and why having an appropriate intake is critical for a rugby player. Energy isn't just about fueling training. It drives every function in your body, from breathing to digesting, repairing cells, to lifting in the gym and sprinting down the field. It's all powered by the energy you get from food. In this presentation, we will cover the following topics. First, we will look at understanding why having an appropriate energy intake forms the base of all we do in performance nutrition. We will look at some ideas around energy balance and availability, and we will review research around energy expenditure in rugby players, discuss some common challenges rugby players have in meeting the energy demands, and start to learn about some key habits we can get into for optimizing energy intake. Energy is truly the foundation of sports nutrition. If your energy intake is too low, the different systems in your body cannot function properly. When you don't consume enough energy, your body begins to conserve resources, which slows recovery, weakens the immune system, and leads to decreased training performance. You can have a very healthy diet with good nutrient intake and good timing, but if the underlying amount of energy being provided to the athlete is insufficient, you'll feel like you're running on empty. Understanding exactly how much energy a rugby player needs is a complex process, and it can be highly variable between individuals. Rather than focusing too much on specific numbers and exact calorie targets, it's more useful to think about the types of habits that increase the likelihood you'll have an appropriate energy intake, which we will begin to cover in this presentation. Some of the key reasons why having an appropriate energy intake is crucial for a rugby player include that rugby players often have very high energy demands due to their busy training schedules and generally large mass. Because of their high energy demand, poor energy intake can be quite noticeable and can be felt through many aspects of a player's performance and well-being. Insufficient energy availability can also hinder training adaptations, impair recovery, and increase the risk of injury and illness. This is a big factor for any athlete, but when we consider the added stress repeated contact places on the body, it becomes even more important that energy needs are met. Having an appropriate energy intake is also important for maintaining and developing a good body composition, which is critical for a rugby player, particularly for those aiming to play at higher levels. So, we know energy is important, but after our body extracts energy from the macronutrients we eat, what do we actually use it for? When we think of energy, we often think of movement and exercise, but it's actually much more than that. Energy use within the body can be split into three main categories. The majority of the energy we extract from food is needed to keep the various systems within the body running. We call this the basal metabolic rate. The next largest use of energy in the body is for physical activity, and the third is something we call the thermic effect of food. Let's dive deeper into these three categories. Every cell, organ, and system within the body needs a constant supply of energy to function properly. Even when you're lying still or asleep, your body is far from resting internally. Your heart continues to beat to circulate blood, your lungs rhythmically draw in oxygen, and your brain remains active, processing information and regulating vital processes. Meanwhile, millions of cells are carrying out repairs, rebuilding tissue, and replacing old or damaged components, all of which require a steady stream of energy. This baseline energy demand is known as your basal metabolic rate, and it accounts for the largest proportion of your total daily energy expenditure, typically around 60 to 70% for most people. In other words, even if you spent the entire day resting in bed, your body would still need a substantial amount of calories just to sustain essential life processes. This highlights why energy is not just about fueling movement or training, it's about keeping you alive, healthy, and functioning optimally every hour of the day. After we have our essential functions running, the next largest use of energy throughout the day is the energy needed to complete physical activity. This includes both more structured exercise activity or training and what we call non-exercise activity, which is everything else. On average, energy for physical activity accounts for around 30% of our energy expenditure. Training sessions, gym work and games can burn significant amounts of energy, but all the non-exercise activities are an important factor here also. Taking your dog for a walk, walking upstairs, doing chores around the house, these things really add up over the course of a day. Two players of identical size can burn significantly different amounts of energy because of what they do outside of training. The key example would be comparing an office worker versus someone in a more labour-intensive job, where they're on their feet all day. For the individual who's on their feet all day, they could easily burn an extra 1,000 to 2,000 calories a day. The third and final use of energy within the body is the thermic effect of food. This is the energy your body needs to digest, absorb and store nutrients from the food you eat. This accounts for around 5 to 10% of our total energy expenditure. When comparing the macronutrients, protein has the highest thermic effect, meaning it takes more energy to digest than carbs or fats. For rugby players eating higher protein diets, this contributes to a slightly higher metabolic rate, as protein requires roughly 20 to 30% of its calories to be used just for digestion and absorption. So, energy is needed to keep our body systems running, for us to move, and for us to help digest and absorb the food we eat. Let's now move on to learning more about the topics of energy balance and availability. Energy balance refers to the relationship between the energy you consume and the energy you expend. When intake matches output, your body weight and energy levels stay stable. This is most commonly described as being at maintenance calories. If you consume less than you burn, you're in a calorie deficit, which might be useful for fat loss, but can also impair recovery, strength and performance if taken too far, or if you're in a deficit for too long. Conversely, if you eat more than you burn, you're in a calorie surplus, which can support muscle gain and training adaptation in the short term, but may also lead to excessive body fat if you take it too far. Whether you want your calories at maintenance, deficit, or surplus can depend on a significant variety of factors, but it is something that should be managed carefully with the help of a sports nutritionist or dietitian. Like with many things in nutrition, reducing things down to just calories in and calories out is taking a too simplistic view of things at times. We know many modifiable factors can influence the expenditure or calories outside, but the calories inside of the equation also has many variables. Factors like someone's environment and psychology play important roles here, and beginning to understand these factors is really important. A good example of this might be a young rugby player who is struggling to gain weight. If I recommend a high-calorie diet that is well suited to their needs, but they have an internal belief that eating higher calories is going to make them fat, then that's going to be a massive barrier to them making a positive change. Rather than just recommending appropriate dietary changes, a good nutritionist also takes into account these various personal factors in a broader context. Energy availability takes the concept of balance a step further. It represents the amount of energy left for your body's essential functions after accounting for the energy spent on training and exercise. Energy availability is crucial for athletes because it determines whether the body has enough fuel to support both health and performance. If that number left over drops too low, you experience low energy availability. Low energy availability might be seen in rugby players who have been poorly educated on their fueling needs, are going through very intense periods of training, or are playing multiple sports. Low energy availability often triggers a survival mechanism in the body, which prioritizes core biological functions over non-essential processes like reproduction, bone building, and optimal immune defense. Instead of directly shutting down, the body essentially puts these systems into a state of hibernation to conserve the limited fuel supply. When the body experiences low energy availability in short durations, it's not generally problematic, but there can be health consequences during periods of chronic low energy availability. Research in this area is developing, and we'll likely learn more about low energy availability in the coming years and how it can be avoided in rugby players. Now we have covered some general concepts within the topic of energy, let's consider some raw numbers. For an average male, non-athletes usually expend somewhere between 1,800 and 2,600 calories per day. Rugby players, on the other hand, often burn between 3,000 and 6,000 calories per day. For most of the amateur players I work with, the energy expenditure is generally between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day, with their overall mass, training and occupation accounting for most of the variation between individuals. Looking more into some research around specific examples of energy expenditure in rugby players, we can see that studies on elite junior rugby league and union players aged 16 to 24 show total daily energy expenditure of around 4,000 to 4,500 calories. Younger players who are in semi-professional type environments can have some of the highest energy expenditures I've seen. This is because while they often have a training schedule that is similar to a professional's, they are usually still growing and have commitments outside of training like work and school. When you combine this with the fact that they often don't get personalised nutrition support, they can be at a really high risk for underfueling. Professional Super League players in the UK have been assessed to have a total energy expenditure of around 5,400 calories per day. It would be very hard to match this expenditure without careful nutrition planning. When your energy needs start to become this high, a lot of effort needs to go into understanding how an athlete can organise themselves such that they have fuel and calories available at every opportunity throughout the day. At this point, it isn't enough to just have 3 meals and a few snacks. It's likely going to be a combination of 4 or 5 meals, a variety of calorie-dense snacks, and often this is where mass gainer protein powder supplements can become a great option. Looking more into the energy demands of a game, at peak intensity, think sprint efforts and repeated collisions, players may expend 20 to 25 calories per minute, whereas at lower intensities, calorie output is likely closer to 10 calories per minute. If we average this out over the course of a rugby match, total energy expenditure during an 80-minute game is likely somewhere between 800 and 1,200 calories. Numbers through a hard training with intermittent periods of heavy contact work and repeated intense efforts are likely to be quite similar. This slide summarises the key factors that will contribute to a lower versus a higher energy expenditure. Total muscle mass is a key one, as muscle tissue has nearly 3 times the metabolic activity of fat tissue at rest. As mentioned previously, the physical activity you do outside of training has a very significant effect, particularly with individuals who are on their feet all day for work and have labour-intensive jobs. Also of importance is the volume of cardio training you complete, which is more energy demanding than gym sessions, for example. For many rugby players, the pre-season period can be the most energy demanding portion of the season, as this is often where the highest amount of running takes place, whereas in the off-season, athletes tend to spend more time in the gym. One crucial point to understand with energy is that 2 players of identical size and training volume can still have very different daily energy expenditures. This simply comes down to genetics and metabolic variation. Some people simply have higher resting metabolic rates than others, even when all other factors are the same. This variation can be quite significant, which is a key reason why rugby players struggle when getting generalised advice and meal plans, as they will not be able to take into account this inter-individual variation. Instead of solely relying on calculated numbers, rugby players should monitor their body weight, recovery and performance as real-world indicators of whether energy intake is appropriate, along with getting support from a sports nutritionist or dietitian. Things like online calorie calculators or fitness apps can be useful starting points, but they're far from perfect. These tools rely on averages and can't account for things like your unique metabolism, muscle mass, or expenditure during training. The equations have to make a lot of assumptions, which leaves them prone to error. Wearable fitness trackers have similar limitations. While they're useful for measuring steps or heart rate, their calorie burn estimates can be wildly inaccurate, sometimes by 20 to 50%. I talk to a lot of rugby players who treat the numbers provided by things like wearables as the full truth. And while they might be useful for identifying trends in your energy expenditure, treating their predictions as accurate and making dietary decisions based on these wearables is unwise. Some of the key challenges around meeting energy demands are as follows. Many athletes underestimate the energy needs, simply due to a lack of knowledge. The vast majority of rugby players will not get nutrition support, and education is lacking for most athletes. It's only in the last 10 to 20 years that top teams have begun to get support, let alone semi-pro and amateur athletes. Practical challenges also act as a barrier. The most common one I've experienced in my own practice is rugby players who work in labour-intensive jobs for 8 to 10 hours a day, but only have one break throughout the whole day. Rugby players also might have body composition goals, which they might prioritise over proper fueling, leaving them at risk of inadequate energy intake. The rising cost of living must be taken into account here also. A group of athletes that often struggle here are university student rugby players who are playing a high level of rugby but also studying full time. For them, simply having enough money to buy good quality food can be a real challenge, as they usually don't have enough time for work. Of course, having labour-intensive jobs often makes it very challenging to meet energy demands. Builders, plumbers, engineers, electricians, support workers and teachers are all occupations in which a high energy expenditure is common. A lack of appetite is also an obstacle at times. When you are having to eat 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day, simply having the appetite to get this amount of food in can be tough, especially when you combine this with a lack of knowledge on how to get more calorie-dense foods into the diet. Younger rugby players can have challenges meeting their energy demands as they're still growing, so they have naturally higher energy expenditures. Of large relevance to young rugby players is that they often also play other sports, sometimes even during the same season. Many older rugby players also have other athletic interests, with competing in running events or CrossFit type competitions becoming common over the last couple of years in populations that I work with. Another consideration here is that social media use is high amongst young populations and people who play rugby. On these platforms, we are constantly being presented with the top 0.1% of people. What we need to be mindful of is that the rugby players who we follow on social media with amazing body composition generally represent genetic outliers. Not everyone can be 105 kg with single-digit body fat, and we should be careful with who we're comparing ourselves to. Another important but often overlooked factor when it comes to energy expenditure in rugby players is contact-induced muscle damage. Rugby players don't just recover from exercise, they recover from collisions. This is different from many other team sports, where it is largely just exercise-induced muscle damage that an athlete is recovering from. Contact-induced muscle damage occurs when external forces, such as tackles, scrums, and physical collisions, cause structural damage to muscle fibers. This type of damage is common in rugby due to the repeated high-impact contact, and it triggers a strong inflammatory and repair response that increases recovery time and raises overall energy requirements. In contrast, exercise-induced muscle damage comes primarily from internal strain on the muscles during training, especially from eccentric movements like sprinting, jumping, or weightlifting. Rugby players therefore consume more energy and protein than athletes in non-contact sports to repair both exercise-related and collision-related damage simultaneously. The heavier the contact load, the greater the energy demand. You're literally fueling the repair of impact damage every time you eat. So if your training week includes high contact sessions, your calorie intake should increase accordingly. Fuel for the work required is a core principle in sports nutrition. That means your energy intake should match the physical demands of your training and daily activity. But with contact athletes, we should also consider that we need to fuel for the damage caused. Let's now get practical and review some simple strategies and tips that will support a rugby player in having a sufficient energy intake. Priority number one is to have a minimum of 3 main meals per day. I often talk with rugby players and they're in such a rush in the morning that they struggle to get in a proper breakfast meal, and their first proper intake of energy might not be till around lunchtime. This is a surefire way to limit your performance. Another good habit to start practicing is to eat more food on intense training days. I find it's often most practical to keep your meals pretty similar on large training days and adjust your fueling through the addition of carb-based snacks. Favorite options I recommend are foods like bagels, dried fruit, and muesli bars. The timing of these snacks becomes more important the more you train, particularly on days when you're training twice. Snacking before training sessions provides a boost of fuel and energy and supports performance in the subsequent session. One other thing to be mindful of is not letting your food intake drop off in the weekends. All too often, I see rugby players eat pretty well from Monday to Thursday, but then as soon as they get to Friday lunchtime, things fall to pieces. For many, when they lose the structure of their workday, they simply forget to eat. Rugby players who run a lot need to be more mindful that they need more fuel than the average player. A good example would be the halfback or hooker, who might cover 2 to 3 times the running distance of a prop in a team training session. More running equals more fuel needed. And I probably sound like a broken record by this point, but if you have a labour-intensive job, this must be accounted for with your energy intake. Some of my preferred methods with helping a rugby player meet their high energy expenditure include the addition of high-calorie snacks. I'd count any snack over 200 calories as getting into a higher calorie territory. Calorie-dense foods with high fat content, like nuts, cheese and hummus, pack a lot of energy into small servings. They're easy to eat when you're not overly hungry and perfect for busy players between sessions or during work breaks. When rugby players have very high energy needs, this is where having some highly processed sugary foods becomes a good option also. Foods like sugary cereals, dark chocolate, crumpets with jam are snack options that I'd often recommend as a dessert-style snack. Healthy fats play a crucial role in meeting energy requirements. Remember, fats provide more than twice the calories per gram compared with carbs or protein, making them very efficient for increasing overall intake. If we use the example of a simple chicken teriyaki bowl, by just adding 1 tablespoon of olive oil while cooking the chicken, 2 eggs and half an avocado, we can almost double the calorie content of the meal without increasing the total volume of the meal a whole lot. And all these fats contribute to our overall health at the same time. Looking for opportunities where I can add healthy fats into a rugby player's diet is a crucial strategy I will use when a rugby player is struggling to meet the energy demands. Finally, another strategy I've had good success with when trying to increase the energy intake of a rugby player is the addition of a pre-bed smoothie. For example, 300 ml of milk, 1 banana, half a serve of mass gainer protein powder, 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, 50 grams of oats and 50 grams of berries is going to provide over 1,000 calories in one shake. Perfect for rugby players who struggle to eat large meals. Having it before bed also supports overnight recovery. It's easy to prepare, most rugby players really enjoy the taste of it, and it fits seamlessly into most routines. The timing of this is relevant here also, as when we're trying to get in a high amount of energy, we want to avoid having more than a few hours without food intake. For many rugby players, they have a large gap between dinner and going to bed with no calorie intake, which is something we want to avoid. That's the end of this presentation. And by now, you'd have a basic understanding of the importance of energy intake in rugby players. Make sure to check out the extra resources I've linked below in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next presentation.